Hey there, friend! Welcome back to Wordsmithing 101. As I'm sure you've already seen from the video's title, we're going to be discussing punctuation. That might sound a bit dry, but believe it or not, it's likely to be one of the most controversial subjects that you've ever encountered. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of topics out there that can prompt anger or even violence, but very few of them are as insidious as this one.
As far as these boys are concerned, hot dogs are sandwiches.
See, despite punctuation arguably being the most important element of written English, it's almost impossible to find two relevant sources that completely agree with one another. There are dozens of rule sets, hundreds of textbooks, and thousands of lessons out there, and literally all of them contradict at least one of the others in some way. That's why I want to start this lesson with a caveat. Everything that you're about to learn here is style agnostic and structurally consistent, so you'll be able to use it almost anywhere. But some guides will probably disagree with one or 2 points. They won't say that any of it's actually wrong, but they might suggest that while some practices are technically correct, they're either uncommon or unnecessary.
But is this enough? Will it work? Will you do the right things?
The reason we're going to cover those things anyway is that it's a good idea to understand this stuff on a mechanical level. You've almost certainly heard that English is always evolving, and that's true, but not in the way that many people think. We can add new words whenever we want, but only because the structure of how those words interact is so robust. Even something written in complete gibberish can start to make sense if we include capitalization and punctuation. So no matter how many new words we invent, they'll all be kept together by just a handful of unchanging rules. Still, because each of those rules deserves an appropriate amount of focus, we'll be dividing this lesson into a few different sections. Each one will have its own controversy associated with it. But if you pay attention to the underlying mechanics, you'll be able to find common ground with anyone who's doing the same thing.
Well, of all the nerve!
The best example, and the one that fits with the theme of this section, is the Oxford comma. You've almost certainly heard of the Oxford comma, but just in case you haven't, the Oxford comma is practically always paired with listing commas. It shows up before conjunctions, words like and or yet, when a sentence contains a list of some kind. He started jumping, flailing, and screaming has an Oxford comma after the word flailing. The debate about whether or not Oxford commas are essential has been raging since their codification in 1905, but they showed up in text centuries before that. Some people say that you don't ever need them, but have a look at that example again. With the Oxford comma, jumping, flailing, and screaming all have the same weight within the sentence. If we drop the Oxford comma though, suddenly the word jumping becomes the primary verb, and the other two are more like elaboration. The punctuation tells us that he's focused on jumping, and that he just happens to be flailing and screaming while he does that. In other words, a lot of the whole Oxford comma debate is missing a deeper detail. There's no universal right or wrong because the mark's presence or absence is the thing that determines what a given sentence means. The differences are sometimes subtle, but they're still differences. And even in cases where those differences don't really matter, Oxford commas should usually be included for clarity's sake. We'll cover some reasons for that a little while later, but for now, let's just say this. Regardless of how you feel about Oxford commas, it's still a good idea to consider how meanings will change when they're omitted.
Why, Susan, that doesn't make sense. Have they left you out of something?
One comma that you should never omit is the clause delineating comma. This is also called the conjunction comma, and although its name makes it sound a bit scary, it's actually really simple to use. Think about the sentence, Patrick was scared of spiders and Liz loved that. They have a weird relationship. The comma shows up before the conjunction and, telling us that we're dealing with a new subject. That's subject in the grammatical sense, by the way, not the conceptual one. Without the comma, the sentence means Patrick was scared of spiders and Liz, and the phrase loved that is a nonsensical addition. Now, maybe Liz is scary, but that isn't what we want to convey here, so we really need to include that conjunction comma. The same thing applies in literally every situation where a sentence's focus shifts to a new subject.
Why are you interested in some subjects and not in others? You must answer these questions if you really wish to get acquainted with yourself.
Now, there are sentences wherein a conjunction comma would be incorrect. In a few seconds here, I'm going to change topics, and I'm going to say, let's switch gears and discuss a few pieces of treasure. There shouldn't be a comma after the word gears. You can see why if you drop everything from the first verb to the conjunction. Let's discuss a few pieces of treasure is still a complete sentence. If we do the same to a sentence that should have a conjunction comma though, we're left with nonsense.
Hey, you'll want it neater than that. And you better check that spelling too.
There's another type of comma that's just as important. But before we get to that, let's switch gears and discuss a few pieces of treasure. See, I told you I'd say that. Don't worry, it isn't an advertisement, it's just me getting way too enthusiastic about antiques. If you're only interested in the English lesson, you can skip to this timestamp. But if you like shiny things, come along with me on a little diversion. This object is called a wine coaster. You don't see too many of them around anymore, but back in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were common household items. As you can probably guess, people would put wine bottles in them, and that would keep furniture from getting stained. What makes this particular wine coaster exciting is the way that it was made. See, silver, the metal, has always had an intriguing effect on us. Even before we discovered that it's the most conductive element, ancient peoples knew that there was something almost magical about it, even more so than gold. As a result, millions of items were made using silver. But because it's pretty expensive, not everyone could afford those products. Now, today we just electroplate things that are made of cheaper metals like nickel or zinc. But back before the advent of electroplating, silversmiths came up with a really creative way of making more affordable items. In 1743, in the city of Sheffield, England, a smith named Thomas Bolsover discovered that silver and copper will actually fuse together under the right conditions. They'll still have distinct colors, but they'll behave like they're one piece of metal. With a bit of care, a craftsman could sandwich a sheet of copper between two much thinner sheets of silver, then work the resulting plate into its intended shape. The process stayed popular until the 1840s, when it was made obsolete by electroplating. But for that 100-year span, objects wrought in Sheffield plate were bought and sold as alternatives to pieces made of sterling silver. This wine coaster is one of those objects. Today, we'd say it's an example of old Sheffield plate, or OSP for short. It wouldn't be worth much if you melted it down, but some collectors value OSP much more highly than they do silver. Personally, my favorite object is this chamber stick. We talked about chamber sticks in the last lesson, so I won't go into too much detail. But because I'm a show-off, I wanted to show off, and call back with a callback. Anyway, if you look closely, you can see some of the copper showing through. That's called the bloom or the bleed, and it's where 250 years of use and polishing has worn away the silver. Collectors nowadays actually look for that. Along with a few other things, it helps to confirm that the piece is genuine and unaltered. This coffee pot is also a piece of old Sheffield plate, but because the silver is so pristine, it's likely that someone had it restored via electroplating at some point. There are ways to tell, but you'd need to look really closely in order to see them. It just goes to show that sometimes the smallest details are the most important, and that's definitely the case with vocative commas. If there's one mistake that people on the internet make more than misspelling a lot as one word, it's neglecting to include vocative commas. Every error changes a sentence's meaning, but this particular one can have some really graphic results. You've probably seen the example involving an elderly woman and cannibalism. The vocative comma in "let's eat grandma" directs the phrase "let's eat" to grandma. If we leave that comma out, "let's eat grandma" is a suggestion for a grisly meal.
Father is certainly enjoying his supper.
That omission becomes an emission when someone thinks that they're writing "come on, people."
Dum dum, diddle dum dum.
Vocative commas can occasionally show up in pairs too. The sentence "get inside, Tom, it's raining" requires two vocative commas if it's directed at Tom. If we leave out the first one, well, we're turning Tom into a tent. And if we leave out the second one, we're saying that Tom is literally falling from the clouds. Basically, any term that represents something or someone being addressed should be delineated by punctuation. That can be a vocative comma and a period if it's the end of the sentence, two vocative commas if it's in the middle of a sentence, or just a vocative comma if it's at the beginning of a sentence. That goes for things like cheering on a team, too. A chant like "Let's go Narwhals" needs a vocative comma because "let's go" is being directed to narwhals. If we leave out the comma, well, "go" suddenly has the meaning "expel from one's body as waste."
In case you're worried, they stepped back just in time.
The only times that vocative commas get a bit tricky are when groups are being addressed. For instance, in this sentence, the comma after subscribed is actually a vocative comma. Everyone who just subscribed is the group that's being addressed. We could have incredibly long phrases that technically function as single entities. All non-feline individuals who want to take the 12:45 train to the recreational center on Europa, please purchase your tickets at the 5th window. With that being said, it's actually the shorter phrases that cause the most confusion. See, something like "I'd like to thank you, Alan and Chantel" should only have one vocative comma. We're addressing two people, but grammatically, we're treating them like a group. If we put a comma after Alan, we're suddenly saying that we'd like to thank Chantel, Alan, and you. It turns the vocative comma into a listing comma. And that brings us back to why Oxford commas are so important.
Look, don't you start that with me. I had a belly full of that back home.
Have a look at that sentence again. If you were seeing it for the first time, how would you know if the comma was a vocative comma or a listing comma? As soon as we add an Oxford comma, the meaning is clear. But the single comma version still has an ambiguous meaning. Some people will tell you that you can derive the meaning from context, and that's true, but maybe not in the way that those people intend. See, Oxford commas provide clarity to more than just the sentences in which they appear. They also provide clarity to entire written works. If you include Oxford commas where they're necessary, then by default, you're also differentiating those phrases from ones that don't include an Oxford comma. Put simply, the absence or presence of a single punctuation mark can completely change how an entire piece of text is interpreted. There are scholars working today who are trying to figure out what authors from the 18th century meant, and the debates often include the question, what if he just made a mistake by not including a comma?
You'll just never know.
So far, we've covered conjunction commas and vocative commas, and we've touched on listing commas. Those are easy. Instead of writing, I had bacon and sausages and pancakes for breakfast, we'd write, I had bacon, sausages, and pancakes for breakfast. That second comma is an Oxford comma, and we covered that too. What we haven't covered is the introductory comma, and that one also gets overlooked a lot. Whenever we begin a sentence with an establishing clause, we need to have a comma that separates it from everything else. That night, Dave burped at 200 decibels. We include the comma to establish that night as the setting for the rest of the sentence. Without the comma, we have an incomplete sentence that refers to a specific night when Dave belched. A lot of people mistakenly include introductory commas where they don't belong, though. It's a problem that's partially caused by the myth that commas denote pauses. They don't, but they do get taught that way when children are learning to translate speech into text. Dave's favorite food is chocolate-dipped pickles shouldn't include any commas at all, and we can see that if we compare the sentence to another one. Dave is burping actually has an identical structure. Dave is the subject, just like Dave's favorite food is the subject. This might be a good time to mention that introductory commas also work with if-then statements, although they're sometimes called conditional commas in those contexts. If Dave eats chocolate-dipped pickles, then he'll burp. If we change that comma's placement, the meaning of the word then changes too. It's suddenly referencing a time. Lots of seemingly simple words have completely different meanings when they're paired with commas, and where they appear within sentences affects things too. The word so is a great example of this. You've probably seen people including it at the beginnings of sentences, like with, so I think we've heard enough about Dave. The comma makes the word so into a conversational link like well or anyway. Without the comma, so means either therefore or to a great extent. We've heard so much about Dave, so you should stop mentioning him.
From now on, as far as I'm concerned, he's just a schnuckle.
And what, may I ask, is a schnuckle?
Something to be left strictly alone.
Honestly, we could devote an entire lesson to them. But generally, if a word like now, so, see, well, or all right is at the beginning of the sentence, it should only be followed by a comma if it's a conversational link.
What'd you do wrong this time, Pop?
What do you mean, what did I do wrong?
There is one other type of comma, and that's the interruptive comma. It's typically used with words like though or however. Dave is so interesting though, and he's been through so much. Those commas are interruptive commas. They're also used to delineate appositives, which are basically in-sentence asides. But there's actually a better way to write them, and that better way involves a different punctuation mark. As such, we'll leave that until next time. But before we finish with this lesson, let's see if we can write a paragraph that includes every type of comma. Okay, Dave, let's be clear. Patrick, Rachel, and Sophia have all voiced concerns, and Liz filed a formal complaint. At the last meeting, you ate chocolate-dipped pickles in front of everyone. You didn't offer to share, though, and that's unacceptable. Like always, if you can do better, which really shouldn't be that hard, leave your paragraph for everyone to read in the comments. Otherwise, well, thanks for sticking around until the end of the lesson. We'll cover more about punctuation next time, and we'll get ready to confront the mark that leaves so many people feeling confused. You probably know the one that I'm talking about, but we won't say its name just yet. Also, it's actually pretty simple to use. For now, though, I'll leave you with this. Carefully considering clauses' commas can cultivate comprehension. Did you know that the term alliteration only applies when the words start with consonants? If they start with vowels, it's actually called assonance. When I first heard that, I thought it was a made-up word for an echoing fart. Yeah, we're ending this on a classy note, aren't we?